This is a homily for the fifth Sunday in Ordinary Time. The first reading is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 58, verses 7 to 10. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 5, verses 13 to 16. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. As you're aware, we are now in year A, the year of St. Matthew. And because this year is dedicated to Matthew, it's worth spending a few minutes getting to know the man whose gospel we'll be hearing for most of this year. So, who is Matthew? One of the striking things about Matthew's Gospel is this: it never circulated anonymously. Every ancient manuscript we possess bears the title characterise, according to Matthew. These manuscripts come from different regions, different lines of transmission, yet they all agree on the same title. In all our manuscript evidence, we haven't found a single copy of this Gospel attributed to anyone else other than Matthew. Here you can see the title of Matthew's Gospel in Codex Vaticanus, dated between 325 and 350 AD. It's interesting to note that here Matthew is spelt in Greek with a double theta, kata math thion. In the earliest Greek manuscripts, proper names often appear in multiple spellings, especially when transliterating Semitic names. Matthew's name comes from the Hebrew Mattathiyahu, and Greek scribes rendered it in several ways. Mathion in Vaticanus is simply one of the standard ancient spellings, not an error. Now, a second important question arises. Is the toll collector named Matthew that we meet in chapter 9, verses 9 to 13, the same Matthew who wrote the Gospel? Keep in mind that Mark and Luke name this toll collector Levi. This suggests that he may have had two names, as many Jews did. One perhaps a family name, Levi, and the other a personal or occupational name, Matthew, from the Hebrew Mattathiyahu, which means gift of God. The early church unanimously identified the Apostle Matthew with the author of the Gospel. However, modern scholarship is more cautious in responding to the question, is the toll collector Matthew the same Matthew who wrote the Gospel? The Gospel shows a deep Jewish knowledge of Scripture and the skills of a trained scribe, traits that could plausibly belong to a former toll collector. However, the Gospel is also written in polished Greek and makes careful use of the Gospel of Mark. Because of this, many scholars think that the final form of the Gospel was produced not by Matthew writing alone, but within a community shaped by his teaching. This is what scholars mean by a Matthean community, a circle of believers shaped by Matthew's preaching and memories, who preserved his teaching and eventually wrote it down in the form that we now have. In that sense, the Gospel still comes from Matthew, even if its final wording reflects the work of a community gathered around him. This leads naturally to a third question. Was Matthew a tax collector or a toll collector? What did those terms mean at that time? Does the Gospel tell us where he was based? Matthew is often called a tax collector, But the Greek word used in the Gospel, telones, is better translated toll collector or customs officer. He was not a civil servant collecting income or land taxes. Rather, he worked at a telonion, a toll booth, where travellers and merchants paid fees on goods moving along trade routes. Such collectors were widely disliked, not because they kept financial records and processed toll payments, but because they operated within a corrupt system that allowed overcharging, and because they collaborated directly or indirectly with Roman authority. The Gospel itself gives a clue to Matthew's location. Jesus calls him while he was sitting at the toll booth. And since the surrounding narrative places Jesus in Capernaum, most scholars conclude that Matthew's booth was based there at Capernaum, on a major trade route and near a political boundary. It was an ideal place for a customs station. One last introductory question. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 52, Jesus says to his disciples, "Every scribe instructed for the kingdom of heaven brings out from his storeroom things both new and old." Has Matthew inserted a biographical note here? Is he suggesting that he is such a scribe? Matthew never directly identifies himself as this scribe, but it is easy to see why early Christians made this identification. Matthew is very much like the kind of scribe for the kingdom that Jesus describes. Someone who opens the storeroom of Israel's scriptures and brings out treasures old and new. The verse beautifully expresses what Matthew's Gospel does. It weaves together the old, Israel's scriptures, with the new, the teaching and mission of Christ. So while the verse may not be strictly autobiographical, it captures perfectly the role Matthew plays as a teacher, shaping his community's understanding of Jesus. As we listen to Matthew's Gospel this year, we are listening to the voice of a man whose life was changed when Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Once a toll collector at the border post of Capernaum, despised, compromised, yet literate and capable, he became a scribe trained for the kingdom, bringing out treasures both old and new. The man who once kept the accounts at the toll booth in Capernaum is now the one who hands on to us the story of Jesus Christ. Matthew reminds us that Christ does not discard our past. He redeems it and turns it into a vocation. Let's now turn to today's Gospel. As we saw last week, Matthew retains the basic narrative structure of Mark's Gospel, but he also arranges the teaching of Jesus into 5 major discourses. Last week we began reading from the first of those 5 discourses, and today we continue reading from the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus ascends a mountain. As we saw last week, Matthew is again using the Exodus story as a backdrop to the Gospel story. God called Moses to the heights of Mount Sinai and entrusted the Torah to him. On another mountain, Jesus brings the law entrusted to Moses to its fulfillment. Jesus then sits and begins to teach. In the Gospels, Jesus sitting down to teach is not a casual detail. It signals something profoundly important about his identity and authority. In the Jewish world of the first century, to sit was the posture of the teacher with authority. Rabbis did not typically stand to expound the Torah. They sat, and their disciples stood or gathered around them. Sitting marked the moment when official, binding instruction was given. In today's Gospel, we have two metaphors that characterise the essence of discipleship: salt and light. If the disciples of Jesus are people whose lives are formed by the Beatitudes, they will become a blessing for the world. They will become salt and light. Jesus tells his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world." In the Greek text, the initial you, humes, is emphatic. It's emphatic because this pronoun is unnecessary in the Greek. And secondly, it's emphatic because it's placed at the beginning of the sentence. So the emphasis is on the you. This is a bold recentering of Israel's vocation around Jesus and his disciples. In Second Temple Judaism, Israel as a whole, and in some texts, the Torah, Jerusalem, or the Temple, were seen as a light to the nations and salt of the earth. Matthew is not saying that the Torah is not light, or that Israel is not called to be light. The Hebrew Scriptures clearly affirm both. What Jesus does is to relocate Israel's vocation in himself and in those who follow him. The disciples are not a replacement for Israel's calling, rather they are its embodiment, gathered around Jesus, the one in whom Israel's mission reaches its fulfillment. Jesus tells his disciples that they are not salt and light to Israel alone. They are salt and light to the whole world. This, of course, foreshadows the final commission of the risen Lord to his disciples at the very end of the Gospel. "Go, therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." Let's now have a closer look at these two metaphors of salt and light. Firstly, salt. Salt was an enormously valued commodity in the ancient world. The Romans even had a proverb, "Nil utilius sole et sale." Nothing is more useful than sun and salt. Roman soldiers received an allowance of salt as part of their pay. This allowance was called a salarium, coming from the Latin word for salt, sal. Our word salary is derived from the Latin salarium. Until quite recent times, salt was essential for preserving meat, long before refrigeration was invented. Salt played an essential role in Jewish life. It was important symbolically and was essential for Jewish ritual. Salt was an essential requirement for all sacrifices. In the book of Leviticus we read, "You will put salt in every grain offering that you offer, and you will not fail to put the salt of the covenant of your God on your grain offering. To every offering you will add an offering of salt to your God." The Talmud is explicit that every sacrifice required salt, and texts from Qumran show that the Essenes insisted on the same. Josephus tells us that great quantities of salt were stored in the temple precincts for daily use. Salt functioned as a symbol of permanence, and hence the term salt of the covenant. The book of Leviticus stated that honey and leaven cannot be used in sacrifices. The reason for that is that honey and leaven symbolize fermentation and subsequent decay and decomposition. Salt, however, is a preservative. The idea of permanence is the basis of the expression salt of the covenant that is mentioned in Leviticus and in various other places in the Bible. When Jeroboam and the 10 northern tribes break away from the house of David, Abijah, the king of Judah, assures Jeroboam that God has given the kingdom to the house of David as a covenant of salt. In other words, it was permanent. Salt was, and still is, a condiment. Job asks rhetorically, "Is insipid food eaten without salt?" And in the book of Ecclesiasticus, Ben Sirah includes salt among the essentials of life. The prime needs of human beings for living are water and fire, iron and salt, wheat flour, milk and honey, the juice of the grape, oil and clothing. The scriptures refer to the cleansing and hygienic power of salt. In the second book of Kings, we find a story about the people of Jericho telling the prophet Elisha that their city is pleasant to live in, but the water is bad and the land suffers from miscarriages. He instructs the people to bring him a new bowl with some salt in it. He then went to the spring of water, threw salt into it, and said, "The Lord says this, I have made this water wholesome. Neither death nor miscarriage shall come from it any more." And then, we're told, the water became wholesome, as it is today, just as Elisha had said it would be. In the book of Ezekiel, we hear that a newborn child was washed with water, rubbed with salt, and wrapped in swaddling clothes. These were the simple but tender actions that every midwife in the ancient world performed to welcome a child into life with dignity and love. Salt cleansed the infant, protected the skin, and symbolized purity and strength. It's interesting to note that in the older ritual of baptism in the Roman Rite, the celebrant blessed salt and placed a small pinch of it on the infant's tongue. The blessing of salt asked that this creature of salt might become a perfect remedy for all who receive it and remain with them. Then, when the salt is placed on the tongue, the priest says, "Receive the salt of wisdom. May it bring you God's favour unto eternal life." Australian Cistercian monk Michael Casey describes the function of salt in these words. We know that part of the quality of salt is to be unassuming. No normal person wants the flavour of salt to dominate their meal. The purpose of adding salt is not to super add flavour, but to bring out the natural and inherent taste that is in the food. It is like cleaning a window so that you can look out on the scenery with greater clarity. You don't want to see the window, you want to see the view. Salt encourages the latent flavour to come forth and delight us, but it is strictly a backroom operation. Salt does its work and retires. Perhaps that gives us an insight into what it means to be the salt of the earth. The followers of Jesus are like salt because the religion they practice is meant to bring out the inherent, God-given qualities of life. As salt enhances food, they are called to enhance life. As Jesus says in John's Gospel, "I have come so that you may have life and have it to the full." You are the light of the world. Your light must shine for all people. This is similar to the analogy of cleaning a window. We don't want to look at the window, we want to look through it. Likewise, we don't erect street signs so that we can stand and look at them. Their function is to light the way for us. Jesus cautions us against putting our light under a tub. Whatever humility is, it's certainly not a denial of God's gifts. For evil to thrive, it is sufficient that good people do nothing. If we don't shine, others are deprived of light. Perhaps we're too timid, we're too unsure of ourselves to step out onto the stage. We hold back. The first letter of St. Peter encourages us always to be ready to make our defence to anyone who demands from us an accounting for the hope that is in us. But that, of course, presupposes that other people are able to see the hope that is in us, that we haven't hidden it under a tub. When Jesus speaks about a city built on a hilltop that cannot be hidden, he would surely have been thinking of Jerusalem, especially during the Festival of Tabernacles. Here you can see the courtyard of the women in the Jerusalem temple. Notice the 4 large lampstands. The Mishnah describes the lighting of these lampstands at the close of the first day of the Festival of Tabernacles. And when lit up during the Feast of Tabernacles, Jerusalem truly was the light of the world. The Mishnah tells us that these lampstands produced so much light that there was not a courtyard in Jerusalem that did not reflect the light. In John's Gospel, it was against the background of tabernacles that Jesus declared, "I am the light of the world." The book of Isaiah tells us that God had called his people to be a light to the nations, so that God's salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. Today's first reading from the prophet Isaiah tells us how our light will shine like the dawn. Share your bread with the hungry and shelter the homeless poor. Clothe the man you see to be naked and turn not from your own kin. Let me offer you an example of what that might look like in today's world. David Bousseau grew up in an orphanage in New Zealand with little to his name and no family support. In 1966, at the age of 25 and newly married, he moved to Australia. By sheer determination and entrepreneurial skill, he built a series of successful construction companies. By the age of 35, he was a multi-millionaire. It was Kerry Packer, then Australia's richest man, who triggered a turnaround in David's life. Early in 1974, one of David's companies was employed to restore Kerry Packer's Bellevue Hill mansion. Among other jobs, the restoration involved building gun cases and cocktail cabinets. One evening, when the project was almost completed, Kerry Packer phoned David at home. David was in the midst of bathing his 2 young daughters, but Packer ordered him to get over to his place immediately. A catch on one of the cocktail cabinets wouldn't close, and he was holding a party that evening. "I'm embarrassed. This beautiful cocktail cabinet won't close." David went, but he was indignant that Packer had that kind of power over him. That triggered in my life this sense that I wasn't on the planet to pamper to the rich and famous, and maybe I'd lost my way in terms of what my purpose was. David explained his change of outlook in terms of the economics of enough. In other words, he already had enough for a comfortable lifestyle. David began to wind down his businesses, and the family decided to move to Darwin to assist with the reconstruction in the wake of Cyclone Tracy, which hit the city on Christmas Day 1974. The church that David attended in Darwin had a relationship with an Indonesian church located in an area that had been devastated by an earthquake. So David volunteered to help rebuild a small village of about 1,000 people, most of whom were tenant rice farmers. It was here that David hit on the idea of microfinance. It happened like this. One of the rice farmers told him that his wife was expecting their third child, but his first two children, aged about 6 and 7, had already been mortgaged to loan sharks and landowners. As is typical in a situation like this, the person who makes the loan takes the children away to work in a carpet factory or a cigarette factory as a way of repaying the loan that the parents had to take out. A loan that they had to take out just to survive between the rice harvests. It was a bondage, a forced slavery. David asked the farmer what he was good at apart from rice farming, and he replied that his wife could sew very well. David offered to loan the farmer some money to buy a sewing machine so that his wife could make a few clothes and sell them at market. They signed a contract agreeing that this was a loan, a simple commercial transaction. They bought a sewing machine and the farmer's wife went to work. Within 9 months, they had bought a second sewing machine and employed another person from the village to work for them. Within 18 months, the rice farmer had repaid all the money he had borrowed from the loan shark and could redeem his children. The family had been set free from bondage. In 1979, David founded Opportunity International with a like-minded counterpart in the United States. Like the mustard seed, David's project started out very small, one family in a small village. Now, well over 40 years later, Opportunity International has 1.25 million loans to people in 23 countries, averaging $220 per loan. The organisation employs 9,800 people in 28 countries around the world, but they also create a job every 30 seconds of the day. They have a 97.5% repayment rate. In the end, Jesus' call to be salt and light brings us back to something simple and profound. Salt works quietly. Light works naturally. That's how discipleship works too. Matthew's own story shows that God can take an ordinary, compromised life and make it a channel of grace. Isaiah teaches that light rises wherever mercy is practiced. And David Bousseau shows that one act of generosity can transform a family, a village, even a future. May the Lord make us people whose words preserve what is good, whose actions scatter the darkness, and whose lives help others glimpse the goodness of God.